My father exiled me to a lifeless wasteland. At the exact same moment, he handed my older brother the keys to a luxury penthouse. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a carefully calculated statement. A loud, clear declaration of exactly what my family thought I was worth. Dead dirt. The air in the private dining room of the country club smelled like expensive steak and aged wine. We were supposed to be celebrating my college graduation. Instead, it felt like a coronation ceremony for Julian. My mother, Eleanor, spent the entire evening adjusting his collar and pouring his champagne. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, completely invisible. I was used to this. Julian was the golden boy. He was the brilliant tech founder who was going to change the world, even though his previous ventures had quietly burned to the ground. I was just Clara, the quiet girl who chose to study landscape architecture instead of something lucrative. When dessert arrived, my father, Arthur, stood up and tapped his crystal glass. He reached into his tailored suit pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He slid it across the white tablecloth to Julian. Inside was a heavy, gleaming silver key. My father proudly announced that he had purchased the top floor of a new high-rise downtown for his brilliant son, a space where Julian could entertain wealthy investors and build his future empire. The table erupted in applause. My mother actually wept with joy. Then, my father turned to me. The warmth vanished from his eyes. The smile dropped from his face. He did not have a velvet box for me. He reached into his leather briefcase and tossed a thin, slightly wrinkled manila envelope onto the table. It slid off the polished wood and landed directly in my lap. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single stack of legal documents and a faded photograph. I stared at the image. It was a property called Blackwood. I recognized the name from old, bitter family arguments. It was a massive plot of land hours away in the freezing countryside, completely abandoned for decades. The photograph showed a house with a caved-in roof, shattered windows, and acres of dead gray soil. It looked exactly like a graveyard. I looked up at my father, waiting for the punchline. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair and looked down his nose at me. "He told me to take this ruin," he said, and I will never forget the exact cold cadence of his voice. "At least out there, you cannot ruin anything important." The cruelty hung heavy in the air. Julian smirked, swirling the wine in his glass. My mother simply looked away. They were waiting for me to break. They wanted tears. They wanted a pathetic screaming match so they could call me hysterical and ungrateful. I did not give them the satisfaction. My chest tightened, and my throat burned. But I forced my face to turn into solid stone. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I carefully placed the papers back into the envelope, tucked it firmly under my arm, and stood up. I looked my father dead in the eye, quietly said thank you, and walked out of the restaurant. I did not know how I was going to survive out there in the freezing dirt. But as the heavy oak doors closed behind me, a quiet, terrifying calm washed over my mind. I was going to build an empire out of that ash, and I was going to make them regret every single word. 3 weeks later, I pulled my beat-up sedan onto the gravel driveway of Blackwood Estate. The temperature was dropping fast. The first bitter frost of late November clung to the dead weeds. When I stepped out of the car, the silence was deafening. My father was right about one thing. It was an absolute ruin. The main house was a crumbling Victorian shell. Half the roof shingles were missing. The front porch sagged under the weight of rotting wood. Inside, it smelled like damp earth and abandonment. The ceiling leaked in 3 different places, leaving dark, frozen stains on the warped hardwood floors. I stood in the middle of what used to be a grand parlor, wrapped in my winter coat, watching my own breath turn into thin white smoke. That is when I found the pile of mail. It was shoved into a rusted metal box near the back door, half frozen together, mostly junk. But at the bottom, there was a thick stack of official envelopes from the county tax assessor. I tore the top one open. The words at the top of the page made my blood run cold. Notice of default. Tax lien. My father had not given me a piece of land to build my future. He had handed me a ticking time bomb. The property taxes had not been paid in 7 years. The county was exactly 45 days away from seizing the entire property and selling it off at a public auction. My father knew this. He transferred the deed to my name to wash his hands of the massive debt. He threw me a heavy financial anchor, fully expecting me to drown. Panic tried to claw its way up my throat. I sat on a dusty crate in the freezing kitchen, staring at the staggering dollar amount printed in bold black ink. Most people would have walked away. They would have let the county take the land and moved on. But I remembered the smirk on Julian's face. I remembered my father telling me I could not ruin anything important. I was not going to let them win. I pulled out my laptop and logged into my bank account. I had exactly $3,422. It was every single penny I had saved from working late shifts at the campus library for 4 years. I looked at the tax document again. The absolute minimum payment required to stop the foreclosure and buy myself 1 year of grace was $3,100. I did not hesitate. I typed in my routing number and hit pay. I was left with $322 to my name. I was standing in a freezing, rotting house in the middle of nowhere. But it was mine. The long game of survival had just begun. The first night in that house, I slept in the dry, cracked cast-iron bathtub. It was the only space small enough to trap my own body heat. The winter wind did not just blow outside. It howled through the shattered window panes, whistled down the crumbling brick chimney, and clawed at the peeling floral wallpaper. I wore 3 pairs of thick socks, 2 oversized sweaters, and my heavy winter coat, wrapped tightly in a dusty canvas tarp I had dragged out of the rotting shed. I lay there in the pitch black, listening to the old floorboards groan, staring up at a ceiling that looked ready to collapse. When morning broke, the brutal reality of my survival set in. The cold was a heavy physical weight. It made the rusty metal hinges of the doors scream. It made my knuckles crack and bleed as I dragged heavy black trash bags filled with decades of damp, rotting debris out to the frozen front yard. I had exactly $322 left in the world. I could not afford a contractor. I could not afford a heating system. I bought a cheap hammer, a box of galvanized nails, and a second-hand handsaw. I spent 14 hours a day ripping up moldy oak floorboards and patching the gaping holes in the roof with whatever solid scrap wood I could salvage from the collapsed barn. My muscles ached in ways I did not know were possible. My hands, which were trained to sketch delicate architectural designs, were now permanently bruised, blistered, and stained with black dirt. But the physical agony was absolutely nothing compared to the deafening silence from my family. My phone never rang. Not once. My mother did not call to ask if I had food to eat. My father did not check to see if the roof had caved in on my head. They had simply erased me from their reality. One evening, huddled by a tiny propane camp stove trying to boil a pot of water, I opened social media. My screen immediately lit up with a brightly colored video of Julian. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, holding a crystal glass of champagne, standing in the middle of his sprawling new downtown penthouse. The caption proudly announced that his tech startup had just secured a massive multi-million-dollar round of venture funding. In the background, I saw my parents. My mother was wearing a heavy diamond necklace. My father was vigorously patting Julian on the back, his face glowing with absolute undeniable pride. They were celebrating his imaginary genius, raising their glasses to his success. While I was sitting on a freezing bucket in the dirt they had thrown me into, I turned the phone screen down on the dusty floorboards. I did not cry. I did not type out an angry comment. I just drank my hot water, picked up my hammer, and went back to work in the dark. By the 3rd week of December, I hit a massive physical wall. The main load-bearing beam in the parlor was rotting from the inside out. If I did not replace it before the heavy snowstorms arrived, the entire second floor was going to cave in. I drove my sputtering sedan into the nearby town to find the local hardware store. The town was small and quiet. Just a single main street lined with old brick buildings and bare winter trees. I walked into the hardware store and headed straight for the lumber section. I stood there staring at the massive, heavy timber beams, doing the brutal math in my head. I could afford the wood, but I could not afford the delivery fee, let alone the specialized heavy machinery needed to hoist it into place. I pulled out my notebook and started frantically sketching out a manual bracing system, trying to figure out how one person could lift a massive beam using only climbing ropes and steel pulleys. A rough, gravelly voice broke my concentration. She asked if I was planning on killing myself or just tearing down the rest of the house faster. I spun around. Standing there was a woman in her late 50s. She wore heavy steel-toed boots, faded denim overalls covered in fresh sawdust, and a thick flannel shirt. Her gray hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her hands were weathered and scarred from years of hard labor. I quickly closed my notebook and defensively told her I was just looking at the timber. She did not back down. She reached out and snatched the notebook right out of my hands. I braced myself for her to laugh at me, but she did not laugh. She stared at the sketch. Her eyes narrowed behind her wire-rimmed glasses. She traced the complex lines of my structural plan with a calloused finger. She asked where I learned to draw a load distribution plan like that. I told her I studied landscape architecture and structural design in college. I told her I was trying to save the old Blackwood estate. She snorted. She said everyone in town knew that property was a cursed money pit. She warned me it was going to swallow me whole. I looked her dead in the eye and told her it was the only thing I had to my name, and I was not going to let it fall down. The woman studied my face for a long, quiet moment. She saw the ingrained dirt under my fingernails. She saw the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes. But more importantly, she saw the sheer, stubborn refusal to quit. She handed the notebook back to me. She told me her name was Maggie, and she owned the local carpentry business. She bluntly stated that my rope and pulley idea was going to snap and crush my skull. Then, she did something I never expected. She told me to go wait by the loading dock. She was going to bring her heavy-duty flatbed truck. That afternoon, Maggie drove out to the estate. When she saw the catastrophic state of the main house, she just shook her head. But she did not leave. We spent the next 8 hours working side by side in the freezing cold. She brought hydraulic jacks, heavy steel braces, and a level of pure expertise I desperately needed. We did not talk much. We communicated through the rhythm of hammers, the loud whine of the circular saw, and the shared, grueling effort of holding up a crumbling roof. When the sun went down and the structural beam was finally bolted secure, we sat on the dusty porch steps. I offered her a cheap cup of instant coffee. I pulled out my battered wallet, my hands physically shaking. I asked her how much I owed her for the labor and the equipment rental. I knew it was going to wipe out my last few dollars. Maggie looked at my thin wallet. She looked at the reinforced house. Then she asked to see my notebook again. She flipped past the structural diagrams and found my full, long-term plans for the property. I had drawn out a detailed vision for a high-end, luxury bed and breakfast, restored Victorian architecture, wraparound observation porches, and elegant guest suites. Maggie closed the book with a loud snap. She said she did not want my pocket change. She told me she had been building boring, cookie-cutter kitchen cabinets for 20 years, and she was sick of it. She proposed a deal. She would provide all the heavy tools, the trade discounts on premium materials, and her master labor to help me rebuild the main house. In exchange, when the bed and breakfast officially opened, she wanted 20% of the gross profits for the first 5 years, and her name permanently carved into the front door frame as the master builder. I stared at her, completely stunned. It was not just a fair deal, it was a lifeline. It was the very first time in my entire life that someone looked at my hard work and saw actual, tangible value. My own family saw me as a human dumping ground for a tax debt. Maggie saw me as a business partner. I put my bare hand out. We shook on it. Her grip was firm, rough, and deeply reassuring. In that single freezing moment on a broken porch, my lonely fight for survival ended. I was no longer a discarded daughter hiding in the ruins. I had an ally. I had a master carpenter. And together, we were going to build an absolute fortress. That spring, the legal fortress was sealed, and just as the ink dried on the trust documents, Blackwood Estate fully woke up from its long, bitter sleep. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Maggie and I had spent 14 grueling months covered in sawdust, plaster, and paint. We had painstakingly restored the grand wraparound porches, replacing every rotting board by hand. We polished the original wide plank oak floors until they shined like dark glass. We filled the sweeping, high-ceilinged rooms with heavy, beautiful antique furniture we salvaged from local estate sales, bringing a warm, rich elegance back to the hollow shell. But the real magic, the thing that took our breath away, was happening outside, in the cold spring air. The heirloom apple orchard, those twisted black branches I almost cut down, erupted into a massive, breathtaking ocean of white and pale pink blossoms. The sweet, heavy scent of the flowers drifted through every single open window of the main house. It smelled like pure, undeniable victory. We officially opened the doors of the Blackwood Bed and Breakfast on the first weekend of May. We did not have a massive marketing budget. I did not hire a public relations firm. I just took a few pictures on my phone and posted them on a local community social media page. I hoped we might get a few weekend travelers from the next county over just to pay the first month of utility bills. I was completely unprepared for what happened next. A young woman from the city booked a room for our opening weekend. She was a travel writer, completely burned out from the noise, the concrete, and the endless rat race. She spent 3 quiet days sitting on the wraparound porch, wrapped in a heavy blanket, drinking hot tea and staring out at the blooming orchard. When she left, she wrote a long, deeply emotional article about her stay. She called Blackwood a forgotten piece of American history, resurrected by sheer human will and calloused hands. She posted a short video showing the morning mist rolling through the twisted, historic apple trees and the warm, glowing lights of the Victorian house against the dark blue twilight. The video absolutely exploded. It struck a deep nerve with people who were desperate for something real and authentic. It gained 2.5 million views in less than 48 hours. My phone started vibrating on the kitchen counter, and it quite literally did not stop for a week. The online reservation system I had built crashed twice from the sheer volume of traffic. By the end of the month, every single guest suite was fully booked. Not just for the summer season, we were completely sold out for the next 18 solid months. Wealthy couples from the city were begging to get on a wait list, offering to pay double the daily rate just to sleep in the exact house my father had coldly called a lifeless wasteland. But the luxury rooms were only the beginning of the empire. When autumn finally arrived, the heirloom trees produced a massive, staggering harvest. The branches were heavy with deep crimson and golden fruit. We hired a dozen local workers to help us hand-pick the rare Arkansas Black and Ashmead kernel apples. We partnered with a small, family-owned distillery down the road to press the fruit into small batch, artisanal hard cider. I spent my nights standing over massive copper pots in the commercial kitchen, boiling down the fresh fruit into rich, spiced preserves using an old recipe Maggie's grandmother had left behind. Because the apple varieties were so incredibly rare and complex, the culinary world went completely crazy for them. High-end restaurants in the city started placing bulk orders for our cider. We were selling beautifully packaged glass jars of Blackwood preserves for $35 each in our tasting room, and we could not make them fast enough. Within 2 short years, The rotting property my father had thrown away to escape a tax lien was professionally appraised. The bank valued the historic estate, the thriving hospitality business, and the commercial orchard at $4.2 million. I was no longer the discarded, invisible daughter, but more importantly, I was no longer alone. The town had watched me freeze and bleed for this land. They watched me hire local contractors, buy my daily supplies from the hardware store on Main Street, and share my profits fairly with Maggie. I was invited to Sunday dinners. I knew the names of the cashiers at the grocery store. I had finally found a real, fiercely loyal family, and it was built on mutual respect and hard work, not blood, money, and toxic obligation. I had planted my roots deep into the heavy, rich soil, and I was thriving. While I was building a solid foundation out of dirt, sweat, and wood, Julian was busy building a castle out of thin air. And just like thin air, it all vanished in a spectacular collapse. His tech startup, the one my parents had celebrated with expensive champagne and tearful, arrogant speeches, was nothing but a hollow shell. Julian had completely mismanaged the millions in venture capital funds. Instead of building the actual software platform he promised his wealthy investors, he got greedy and impatient. He thought he was an untouchable financial genius. He quietly funneled millions of dollars of company money into highly volatile cryptocurrency markets, trying to artificially inflate the company balance sheet and line his own pockets. It was a catastrophic failure. The crypto market violently crashed in early autumn. Julian lost absolutely everything in a matter of 72 hours. The investors immediately ordered a forensic financial audit and discovered the massive, glaring hole in the accounts. They did not just fire him. They filed a massive, multi-million-dollar lawsuit against him for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and gross negligence. He was facing total financial ruin, public humiliation, and the very real possibility of federal prison time. My parents panicked. Their golden boy was drowning in a public scandal, and they refused to let him sink. Arthur and Eleanor did exactly what they had always done. They sacrificed their own stability to protect Julian from the harsh consequences of his own staggering arrogance. They completely drained their retirement accounts. Every single penny they had carefully saved for the last 30 years was wiped out to pay for a team of ruthless, high-priced corporate defense lawyers. But even that was not enough. To settle the investor lawsuits quietly and keep Julian out of a federal jail cell, my parents had to take out a massive predatory second mortgage on their beautiful, sprawling city estate. The wealth and status they had lorded over me for my entire life was instantly gone. They were now drowning in suffocating debt, living in a house they could no longer afford, desperately trying to maintain the fragile illusion of high society, while their bank accounts bled dry. It was the second Tuesday of November. The morning air was sharp, carrying the first real bite of winter. I was standing in the main dining room of the Blackwood house, carefully polishing the massive, 20-foot-long oak table. The quiet, rhythmic hum of the industrial coffee roaster drifted in from the back kitchen. Outside, the heirloom apple orchard was bare, resting quietly after producing a massive, highly profitable autumn harvest. Everything in my world was perfectly peaceful. Everything was secure. Then, the peace shattered. I heard the loud, aggressive crunch of heavy tires rolling up the long gravel driveway. I stopped polishing. I walked over to the large bay window and looked out through the glass. A sleek, jet-black luxury sedan parked erratically near the front porch steps. It was a brand-new vehicle. It was almost certainly leased. It was a desperate, transparent attempt to maintain the grand illusion of their high society wealth, while their actual bank accounts were actively hemorrhaging money to pay for Julian and his legal defense team. The driver's side door opened. My mother stepped out into the cold air. Eleanor wore a heavy, sweeping designer coat. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, sprayed firmly into place. But as she walked closer, The harsh morning light betrayed the brutal reality of the last few months. The skin around her eyes was pulled tight with exhaustion. The quiet, arrogant confidence she usually carried in her shoulders was completely gone. It was replaced by a frantic, nervous, almost feral energy. She did not bother to knock on the door. She did not ring the heavy brass bell. She pushed the thick oak front door open and walked right into the grand foyer like she still owned the world. She did not look at the meticulously restored woodwork. She did not notice the expensive, warm lighting. She did not smell the sweet aroma of baking apples and fresh wood polish. She stood there in the entryway, her eyes darting frantically around the expensive antique furniture, doing a silent, desperate, and greedy calculation of what it was all worth. I set down my polishing cloth. I did not walk over to greet her. I did not offer her a cup of hot tea. I stood at the end of the long dining table, folded my hands together and waited. She finally turned her head and looked at me. There was no apology in her eyes. There was no maternal warmth. There was not even a shred of guilt for abandoning me in a freezing, rotting house 2 years ago. She looked at me exactly the way a starving animal looks at a fresh meal. She walked into the dining room and dropped her heavy, expensive leather handbag onto the polished wood. She let out a long, heavy sigh, acting as if she was the one who had spent the last 2 years doing back-breaking physical labor. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if I was happy. She looked at me and coldly stated that we needed to talk about Julian. She did not tell me the truth. She did not admit that her golden boy had illegally embezzled millions of dollars and destroyed their entire financial future. She spun a pathetic, deeply delusional story. She told me Julian had fallen victim to a highly volatile, unpredictable market crash. She claimed his jealous business partners had maliciously conspired against him to steal his revolutionary technology. She painted him as a tragic, deeply misunderstood genius who only needed a safe harbor and a small injection of capital to rebuild his massive empire. I stood perfectly still. I let her talk. I let the absolute absurdity of her toxic lies fill the quiet room. I watched her lips move, realizing for the very first time that she actually believed her own delusions. Then, she crossed her arms tightly across her chest. She delivered the absolute most insulting demand of my entire life. She looked around the beautiful, thriving business I had built with my own bleeding hands and Maggie's heavy tools. She looked back at me, her eyes hardening into black stones. She told me that Julian needed to liquidate this property immediately to cover his massive legal fees and to secure his future. She took a slow, deliberate step closer. Her voice dropped into a cold, sharp, authoritative tone. "You have exactly 3 days to pack your bags and clear out of this house. We are transferring the deed back and handing this entire estate over to your brother. He is a man. He cannot start over from absolutely nothing." The silence in the room became incredibly heavy. A year ago, those exact words would have broken my spirit. A year ago, I would have screamed, I would have cried hot, angry tears. I would have begged her to see my worth, to see my hard work, to love me exactly as much as she loved him. But standing there, inside the massive wooden fortress I had built, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no betrayal. I only felt a profound, chilling clarity. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, and I saw her exactly for what she was. A desperate, empty shell of a human being. She threw me into the dirt to freeze to death, and now she was trying to steal the beautiful garden I had grown from it. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain the irrevocable trust. I did not mention Elias Thorne. I did not tell her about the fortress of legal steel that permanently protected every single blade of grass, every single apple tree, and every single wooden floorboard on this land. I did not owe her an explanation. I only owed her a consequence. I looked her dead in the eye. My voice was completely flat, cold, and entirely hollow. I told her, if Julian wants this estate, tell him to come here and take it. Eleanor smirked. A smug, highly victorious little smile crept across her aged face. She actually thought I was surrendering. She thought my calm, quiet response was nothing but the pathetic obedience of a broken daughter who finally understood her worthless place in the family hierarchy. She thought she had won. She picked up her heavy leather handbag and turned around. She told me she would send a large moving truck on Friday morning. She walked out the front door, her expensive heels clicking loudly against the polished oak floorboards. The heavy front door clicked shut behind her. I watched her sleek black car speed down the gravel driveway, kicking up dust into the cold morning air. She drove away, completely arrogant and completely unaware. She had no idea that she was walking right into a massive, unavoidable legal brick wall, and I was going to let her hit it at full speed. After my mother drove away, I walked back into the dining room. I did not go upstairs to pack my own clothes. I did not look around for empty cardboard boxes. Instead, I called Maggie. I told her we were completely changing our schedule. We had originally planned to host the grand opening of the tasting room in late November. I told her we were moving it up. We were going to host the massive event this Friday, the exact same day my family was planning to arrive with a moving truck to throw me out onto the street. Maggie did not ask any questions. She simply laughed, a deep raspy sound, and said she would call the caterers. I spent the next 72 hours working in a state of absolute focused overdrive. I called Elias Thorne and told him my family was finally making their move. He promised to be there, wearing his best suit, standing right by my side. I personally went down to town hall and invited the mayor. I called the editor of the local newspaper and promised an exclusive front-page story about the historic revival of the Blackwood estate. I sent out a massive email blast to every single person in our community who had helped me hammer a nail, pour concrete, or pick an apple over the last 2 years. I wanted every single witness present. I wanted my family to walk into a solid wall of people who knew exactly who I was and exactly what I had built. I did not sleep for 3 days. We strung thousands of warm, glowing lights through the branches of the heirloom apple trees. We set up massive white canvas tents across the front lawn. We polished the massive copper cider taps until they gleamed in the afternoon sun. Friday morning arrived with perfectly bright blue skies and a crisp, refreshing autumn chill. By noon, the entire front lawn of the estate was absolutely packed with happy people. It was not just a grand opening. It was a joyous community festival. The local high school jazz band was playing lively music on the wraparound porch. Dozens of local townspeople were slowly walking through the blooming gardens, laughing, holding delicate crystal glasses filled with our premium hard cider. The mayor was standing near the front steps, giving a glowing interview to a local television reporter about how my business had single-handedly revitalized the county tourism industry. I stood near the main tasting bar, wearing a tailored dark green wool blazer. I felt completely grounded. I was surrounded by Elias, Maggie, and the people who actually cared about my survival. We were all watching the long gravel driveway. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the crunch of heavy tires echoed over the jazz music. A silver sports car turned off the main road and aggressively sped up the driveway. It was Julian. He was driving a ridiculously expensive vehicle that I knew for a fact was actively being hunted by the bank for repossession. Trailing right behind him was a large, rusted commercial moving truck, and my father's dark gray luxury sedan. They expected to find a quiet, defeated girl sitting on the front porch with a few trash bags, crying over her lost home. Instead, Julian slammed on the brakes. His silver sports car skidded to a violent halt at the edge of the manicured lawn. He threw the door open and stepped out into the cold grass. He was wearing a tailored designer suit, but it looked heavily wrinkled, as if he had slept in it. In his hands, he carried a single empty cardboard box. He had actually brought it to physically pack up my pathetic, worthless belongings himself, thinking it would take 5 minutes. He took one look at the massive white canvas tents, the flashing cameras of the local press, the smiling mayor, and the hundreds of wealthy guests happily drinking high-end cider. His jaw completely dropped. He stood frozen by his car, his eyes wide with absolute raw shock. He looked at the massive, beautifully restored Victorian house. He looked at the perfectly manicured heirloom orchard. He could not comprehend it. In his mind, I was still the useless, invisible sister freezing in the dirt. My father stepped out of the gray sedan behind him. His reaction was even more pathetic. Arthur stared at the massive banner hanging over the porch that read, "Blackwood Heritage Estate. Grand Opening." I could actually see the greedy, desperate wheels turning in my father's head as he mentally calculated exactly how many millions of dollars this entire operation was currently worth. Julian dropped the cardboard box onto the grass. His shock rapidly mutated into explosive, uncontrollable rage. He felt completely humiliated, and he wanted to instantly assert his dominance. He stormed across the lawn, marching straight through the crowd of confused guests. Arthur followed closely behind him, his face flushed red with absolute anger. They pushed past the mayor. They shoved past a local reporter. Julian marched straight up to the wooden tasting bar where I was standing calmly. The jazz band abruptly stopped playing. The entire festival went dead silent. Hundreds of eyes turned to watch the dramatic scene unfold. Julian slammed his flat palm down onto the polished wood bar. His face was twisted into an ugly, entitled sneer. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, completely ignoring the massive crowd of witnesses surrounding us. He leaned forward, yelling at the top of his lungs, his desperate voice echoing loudly across the silent lawn. He screamed that all of this was his. He aggressively demanded that I pack my things and get off his property immediately. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred and shouted that Mom and Dad told me to give it all back. Julian's voice echoed across the lawn, hanging heavily in the dead silent air. Hundreds of people were staring at him. He looked like an absolute madman. I did not flinch. I did not back away from the wooden bar. I just looked at his red, sweaty face and felt absolutely nothing but pity. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, a heavy wooden cane tapped sharply against the hardwood floor. Elias Thorne stepped out from the quiet crowd. He walked up to the bar, standing directly between me and my brother. Elias slowly adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. They bore a heavy, gold-embossed county seal on the front page. Elias did not yell. He spoke with the quiet, devastating authority of a man who had spent 40 years destroying arrogant men in courtrooms. He looked Julian up and down, clearly disgusted by his childish tantrum. He held up the heavy papers. He calmly informed my brother that he was trespassing on private, legally protected property. Julian laughed. It was a desperate, crazy laugh. He pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that I was his sister, and the land belonged to his family. Elias shook his head. He turned slightly, announcing the truth not just to Julian and my father, but to the massive crowd of local reporters standing nearby. He stated clearly that Blackwood Estate no longer belonged to any individual person. He declared that the land, the house, the thriving business, and the massive orchard were the sole, permanent property of the Blackwood Heritage Trust. It was an irrevocable legal entity. Elias leaned in very close to Julian. He told him that he did not own a single blade of grass on this land. He did not own a single drop of cider. He had absolutely zero legal rights, 0%, and zero power here. And if he did not leave the premises immediately, Elias was going to have the mayor personally instruct the local sheriff to arrest him for criminal trespassing. The blood completely drained from Julian's face. He looked back at Arthur. My father looked physically sick. The mathematical reality of his total financial ruin had finally caught up with him. He realized, in front of the entire county, that the millions of dollars he desperately needed to save himself were locked inside a legal vault he could never open. But Julian was not smart enough to accept defeat gracefully. His shock violently shifted back into pure, reckless rage. He lunged forward, reaching aggressively across the wooden bar, screaming that I had stolen his life. He never even made it close to me, before I could even blink. Maggie stepped in front of me, planting her heavy work boots firmly on the floor. She shoved Julian backward with one massive, calloused hand, and she was not alone. The local carpenter who helped me fix the rotting roof stepped up beside her. The woman who ran the hardware store down the street stood on my other side. Within 5 seconds, a solid wall of 50 local townspeople had formed a massive physical barrier between me and my toxic blood relatives. They did not yell. They did not threaten him. They just stared him down with silent, absolute hostility. This was my real family. These were the people who watched me bleed, sweat, and freeze to build this empire from the dirt. They were not going to let a spoiled, arrogant thief tear it down. The local press cameras started flashing rapidly, capturing every single pathetic second of Julian's public meltdown. Arthur grabbed Julian by the back of his expensive jacket. My father looked completely broken. He pulled Julian away from the crowd. His head hung low in absolute shame. They walked back to their cars in dead silence. They got in, and they drove away. There was no grand fight, just the quiet, pathetic exit of two men who finally realized the world did not belong to them anymore. The jazz band started playing again. The crowd cheered. I poured Elias a tall glass of cider, and the festival continued. It has been over a year since that day. The reality of the world outside this estate has been incredibly harsh for the people who tried to destroy me. Julian did not avoid the consequences of his corporate fraud. The massive legal defense fees completely wiped out my parents. Julian narrowly avoided federal prison, but he lost absolutely everything else. Last I heard, the golden boy of the family is currently working the night shift at a massive retail warehouse 2 states away. He spends 8 hours a day lifting heavy cardboard boxes, wearing a cheap yellow safety vest, strictly supervised by managers who do not care about his expensive taste or his massive ego. My parents lost their sprawling city home to the bank. They are currently renting a small 2-bedroom apartment on the dirtier outskirts of the city. A few weeks ago, a thin white envelope arrived in my mailbox. The return address belonged to Arthur. It was likely a letter begging for forgiveness, or more likely begging for a small loan to keep the lights on. I did not open it. I did not even break the seal. I simply carried it inside and dropped it directly into the roaring fire in the living room. Tonight, it is snowing outside. The thick white flakes are quietly covering the heavy, sleeping branches of the heirloom apple orchard. I am sitting in a large leather chair next to the stone fireplace in the main parlor. The house is completely warm, safe, and deeply quiet. I am holding a heavy glass mug of warm, spiced cider that I grew, harvested, and brewed with my own 2 hands. Sometimes, the people who share your blood are the ones who will happily watch you freeze in the dark. But you do not have to stay in the cold. You do not have to wait for them to build a fire for you. You can walk away. You can dig your bare hands into the freezing dirt, plant your own seeds, and grow a beautiful sanctuary they are never allowed to enter. I built a thriving world out of the exact same dirt they threw me into. And the best part is, I get to enjoy every single drop of it, completely in peace.